Hello, everyone. My name is Corey. Thank you all for joining the webinar session today. We're super excited to be here. Just wanted to make a few quick notes before we get started here. We had a few technical issues on our end, and so we do apologize about that regarding the time for the webinar. So if you've had any confusion about that, again, we apologize. We're investigating that for the future to make sure all of our webinar starting times are clear and we don't have any confusion there. At this point, I also just want to mention that we'll be recording the webinar as well. So we will plan to upload that online so you all can check it out again later. And I'll also note that we will run a little bit later than originally planned, just to make sure we have some time for questions. So I know we're starting about 10 minutes later, so we're going to factor that into our Q&A sessions. And at this point, I'll just mention that as well. We will have 2 Q&A sessions in the webinar. So our plan is to have one kind of intermission in the middle and one at the end. Each Q&A session will be about 10 minutes. So again, you can write in questions throughout the webinar, and I'll be here not only myself, but also with my colleague, Ivan Shaikov. He's the product specialist for V-Ray for Cinema 4D. And yeah, we're both just incredibly excited to be here. If you guys have any ideas as well for any tutorial content or anything else that you'd like to see in the future from us, we're also welcoming suggestions. So feel free to write those in the chat, and either my colleagues will try and respond to you there, or if we can't get to all the questions, either in the chat or in the Q&A, then we'll try and follow up with you after the webinar. So on that note, again, my name is Corey Holm. I'm a CG specialist here with Gas Group. And yeah, we're incredibly excited to be sharing with you today V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D. So on that note, let's go ahead and jump in and get started. All right, so we're introducing V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D today, and we will be going over not only how V-Ray 5 works with rendering, and of course everything you'd be familiar with working with V-Ray in earlier versions, but we're also going to be covering some of the amazing new post-processing abilities that you can do in V-Ray 5, and what you can do to not only redefine it as a rendering experience, but also going beyond rendering and polishing your images to get a really complete and final looking result. In the webinar today, we're going to do an overview here of not only just the post-processing, though we're also going to cover a bunch of new features. So in particular, we're going to touch on some of the new settings. We've tried to streamline things throughout V-Ray 5 just to make things more intuitive and make a focus on creativity so that you're not having to focus on parameters so much. We've also made V-Ray 5 an end-to-end solution for rendering. So again, not just focusing on what you can do during rendering, but also what you can do afterwards. We've also introduced a bunch of new tools to make it so that you can work smarter rather than harder, and in particular, speed up your workflows and just make it so that, again, you're not having to tweak as many settings, but can just focus on getting some nice looking results. And as always, we're always trying to introduce support for more Chaos Group products. So in particular, we're going to touch on some examples that we've integrated in V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D specifically. And of course, as I mentioned in the beginning here, a big focus is on post-processing with V-Ray 5. So we've made it now so that you can do more than just rendering, and we'll touch on how you can do compositing with the new V-Ray 5 frame buffer and do a really cool new feature called light mixing, which will allow you to edit and work with your lights even after you've rendered. So to get started, I'm first going to focus here on some of the UI improvements. So a big focus, again, has been to make it so that there's fewer settings and just trying to streamline things so that it's more straightforward and easier for you all to work with. In particular, we've upgraded multi-passes from past versions of V-Ray for Cinema 4D so that they are now known as render elements. And we've created a new render elements manager, which is a brand new interface that will allow you to work with render elements, organize them, and make changes to them. So whenever you're doing rendering and you need render elements, you'll find this nice new interface for working with those. We've also made changes to settings and workflows throughout V-Ray 5. So many things, again, have been streamlined. And we've also even tried to make it so that if you don't know what a setting does or have a question about a parameter, you can very easily access our documentation. And I'll show you a little trick for how to do that. One cool thing now is that we've upgraded the V-Ray menu so that now, for example, lights or V-Ray lights are now separate objects. So if you need to access a V-Ray light, you can just go to the V-Ray menu and go to the Lights tab there, and you'll be able to add a light to your scene. And this is the new Render Elements Manager in V-Ray 5. So you can see on the left here, this is the list of all of our render elements. And you can see we can just drag and drop different render elements you might need, like global illumination, for example. You can also get different render elements, like more advanced ones, such as raw ones. And you can even now create folders, so you can actually categorize or put together, for example, your raw render elements. This will just help you to keep things nice and tidy. And yeah, it's just super convenient and easy to work with when managing your render elements in V-Ray 5. And a quick comparison here of just our render settings. So you can see in V-Ray 3.7 on the left, we've got our render settings, which you can see there's quite a few tabs there. And on the right, we've simplified that down to about 6 tabs. So here you can find all the different settings to access. And we've tried to make changes throughout here just to streamline things. So for example, if you need to change which render engine you're on, you could just go to the render engine dropdown, click on V-Ray, or you can switch to V-Ray GPU in that little dropdown there. So if you're a GPU user, it's very simple now to switch over to V-Ray GPU. And again, throughout all of these settings here, we've made changes just to make things simpler and more straightforward. And this is something I'd like to mention as a tip. So if you are working in a very specific section, like for example, we've opened up the material editor and are working with a V-Ray material. If you have a question about a parameter, so for example, we have this new code amount parameter, you can now right click on it just like in Cinema 4D's native interface. You can right click on it and you'd be able to actually open up the documentation for Chaos Group's specific or V-Ray specific parameters. So if you click on show help there, this will actually take you to our docs pages and take you to the relevant page to get the information you need. So you can just right click on any parameter that's V-Ray specific now and very easily get access to the documentation to answer your questions. So super handy for just speeding up your workflow and getting you information more quickly if you ever have any questions. Of course, a big new feature in V-Ray 5 is the frame buffer. So this is a fully redesigned frame buffer that we've introduced that's going to allow you to do a lot of the new post-processing features. And it's just very, very powerful in terms of how we've made changes to make it easier to work with and deeper in terms of how it's integrated. In particular, a cool thing for Cinema 4D is it can now be docked in the Cinema 4D UI. So if you don't like working with the frame buffer as a separate window, you can now dock it in the Cinema 4D interface. We've also made updates to the render region, so we've made it more dynamic and responsive and faster. So you'll find that's much more useful. In addition, we've introduced a new layer-based editor. So this is where you're going to be handling everything from doing color corrections to doing compositing, working with render layers. And it's just incredibly powerful because basically you can now add and remove or reorder any of your color correction layers at will. You can even create multiple instances of the same color correction. So overall, the workflow is just much more flexible and more robust. And in addition to that, we've even introduced presets so you can save any of your adjustments you've made or any compositing you've done. And we're actually going to touch on that later on, including with the new light mixing capability, which will let you make changes to lights even after you've done rendering. So you could affect their brightness, you could affect their colors, or even turn lights on and off, all of which we're going to dive into much deeper later on. So just a little preview here of what's to come. To start though, let's just touch on the new interface so you can see what you'll be working with. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see a familiar history panel. This would be familiar to anyone who's used the older version of the frame buffer. Here you can load in images or save images that you've rendered, as well as do A/B comparisons. So you could look at a comparison of 2 images or even 4 images and just compare them very easily. In the center there, of course, this is the rendered image results, so what we're working with here. And you'll see up in the right there, kind of top right, you've got your render controls, so be able to stop a render or start an interactive render. And then on the far right here is where we have the new layer-based editing panel. So if we focus in over here and focus in particular on the top part, you'll see that this is where we have all of our layers. So in this case, we've added different color correction layers, and all of these are being applied to the image. And we've also got some compositing layers below. Any layer that we've added here, when selected, is going to then have dynamic properties, which show up below. So for example, we've selected the lens effects, and this will give us access to the different lens effects properties that we can control to affect the lens effects on the image here. So again, very powerful and something we'll touch on in more detail later on. And as I mentioned, you can also dock the frame buffer now in the Cinema 4D interface. So if you were to work with rendering and want to actually keep the interface available, you can just dock it right there and you'd be able to work with it without having to keep it as a separate window. So super convenient if you like to work with it that way. And again, you'd have access to all of the frame buffer's capabilities there. And with any major V-Ray release, we're always trying to make things faster and increase flexibility for you. So in particular, a focus for V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D is improving the interactive rendering. So we've basically rewritten the interactive renderer from scratch, and it's significantly improved in terms of its speed and interaction and just overall much faster. We've also made improvements to compatibility throughout V-Ray 5 and interoperability, so making V-Ray 5 more in line with our V-Ray products for other DCCs. And if you're a GPU user, I think you'll be excited to know that most features are now supported on GPU in V-Ray 5. So again, just always trying to improve compatibility and making V-Ray more robust with each release. We've also introduced some exciting new tools to work smarter. So in particular, we've integrated the NVIDIA AI denoiser. This is an AI accelerated denoiser. It basically will allow you to instantly reduce noise while you're rendering. So it's incredibly helpful for when you're doing interactive rendering and just trying to get a preview without any noise as quickly as possible. We've also made it so that we have automatic checkboxes now for both the white balance and exposure settings. So you can just check those on and V-Ray will automatically set the white balance and give you the proper exposure value without needing to go into any camera settings. So again, speeding up your workflow and just making it easier to get started rendering and focus on getting a nice looking image. You can see an example here. We have the NVIDIA AI denoiser enabled. So we're doing some rendering, and as we slide along here in the timeline, you're going to see it update right away in the render there. And you can see the noise is clearing out super fast. Again, incredibly powerful thanks to the AI accelerated denoising. And just super helpful when you're doing interactive rendering and just want to see what's going on in the scene while you're working. And again, we've also added those auto exposure and white balance parameters. So if you go down to the camera drop down here in the render settings, you'd be able to enable those. And then when you do a render, you'd see, for example, here, if this was our original rendered image and we were to render again with the auto exposure mode checked on, this would show us what the result would look like with the proper exposure value. And if we checked on then the automatic white balance checkbox, we could also get the white balance set. So we have our white colors properly balanced and looking neutral there and giving us a nice looking render result. And in V-Ray 5, a really big focus for us has been on materials and trying to improve how you work with materials so that you can get some really nice, even more complex looking materials without having to go through complex setups or using blend materials. So one example here is the new coat layer. So this would be so that you can create reflective coatings. You can think of it as for materials like metallic paint or varnished wood, certain types of plastics or carbon with coating, for example. And it's super fast to set up. You, again, won't need to use any sort of blend material, and it's just very useful in any case where you might need to have a material that has multiple reflections, or if you've in the past worked with different specular layers, I think you'll find this is just much faster, more convenient, and gets you a really nice looking result without having to do any sort of complex setups with blend materials or anything like that. So just to show you how it works, you can see here on the left, we've selected the coat layer parameters in the V-Ray material, and you can see those are all the parameters available for it. And if we go over to the right here, we've adjusted just one parameter in particular, the coat amount. So if you slide that from 0 to 1, this will basically fully enable the coat, and you can see there in the image preview that the coat amount is fully enabled. We have a nice and glossy looking result. We also have a parameter below that called the coat glossiness, which would control the sharpness of the reflection. So if you bring that down, of course, you can make it less glossy looking. But again, it's a super powerful material with very simple and straightforward controls. So really a lot you can do with it, and it will generally be much faster than using a blend material. So definitely recommend checking it out. And you can see just an example here. We've got these wooden skis with no coat enabled. And if we were to enable the coat layer and bring the coat amount up to 1, then we get a really nice glossy looking coat here. Similarly, we've also introduced a new sheen layer in V-Ray 5. So this would be if you want to create soft fabric materials, so things like velvet, satin, and silk. It's also in general useful for when you just want a material that would have multiple Fresnel IOR layers. So for example, if you needed to create something more complex looking with multiple IOR values, the sheen layer basically simplifies that. Again, you won't need to use a blend material, and it will also render faster than a blend material. And again, just gives you straightforward controls that can give you some really interesting results. So let's take a look. You can see if we click on the sheen in the V-Ray material, we'll have the parameters here. And on the right side there, we've changed the sheen color and the sheen glossiness. So you can see that the sheen color basically works to bring out a color for it. If the sheen color is at black, basically then the sheen is disabled. If we bring it up to a whiter color, we'll be able to see that. And of course, you can even set it to a different color like a purple or whatever you want to use it for. So this is super handy, of course, if you have a diffuse material and you're looking to match the sheen to that. So you could match it or make kind of a lighter version of your diffuse to create some really realistic looking sheens. And then there's a sheen glossiness parameter, which again will control the sharpness of the reflection. So if you were to lower that down, the sheen effect will become more pronounced. And in this case, just to show you kind of an extreme example, we've brought that down to 0, and you can see what the result gives us there in the image preview. So again, very powerful but straightforward controls that can give you some really nice looking results super quickly. You can see an example here. We have this pillow on this couch with no sheen enabled. And if we were to bring up the color and down the glossiness a bit, we can add a nice looking sheen to make this look much more like a fabric. And we've also integrated metalness into V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D. So now you can very easily create some photorealistic looking metals. This basically will act as like an on-off switch. So there's a little slider for metalness that you can use to either make your materials non-metal or metallic. And a really great thing about it is that it also now has a roughness checkbox. So this allows you to easily work with PBR texture maps you commonly see with other software. So you can easily plug in a metalness or roughness texture map and get some really interesting and much more advanced looking metal materials from that. So just to show you how this would work, if you go to the reflection layer in the V-Ray material, you'll see that there is a roughness, a metalness, and a use roughness checkbox there. The metalness slider there in the middle, this is kind of the main thing. So if you slide that from 0 to 1, again, it's like an on-off switch that will change it between a non-metal and a metallic material. And if we then enable the roughness checkbox, this would basically take what is originally the glossiness parameter and inverts that to become the roughness. And so now you can move the roughness slider there to control how rough the material appears. So again, very powerful and super useful if you want to plug in PBR texture maps. So highly recommend checking this out for creating metallic materials in the future. And just an example here, you can see that we've got this chair here with no metal shader. And if we were to enable the metalness parameter, then this will make the chair look metallic. So super straightforward and easy to use, but can give you some really nice looking results. We've also integrated a brand new Car Paint 2 material. So this is a really, really cool car paint material that basically gives you 3 different layers to work with. So there's a diffuse layer, a flakes layer, and a clear coat that you can mix together to create some really interesting looking results. And in particular, the flakes are much more realistic. So those will give you some really beautiful looking flakes, and it uses less memory. So it's overall just a faster material. You can see an example here. We have a car paint material applied to this train. So that would be the black material there, but it does not have any flakes applied to it at the moment. If we were to add some flakes and also the clear coat, then you can get this really nice looking flakes and just get a really interesting looking material there. So again, lots you can use it for and create with those different 3 layers. So definitely something to check out if you're looking to create something with a kind of a car paint type of look to it. And we've also introduced a new hair material. This is an integration of the hair material from V-Ray Next. And the basic premise for it is that we've created some parameters that are based on the physiology of real hair. So essentially, you can very easily get some super realistic looking hair results and hair colors that don't take any experimentation. You won't really have to tweak arbitrary color values or try and figure out what would look right for a hairstyle. Instead, you can just adjust these sliders that will control the pigmentation of the hair, and this will get you some really realistic looking results without any hassle, without having to understand really even what would look good. You just can move those sliders around and get some really cool looking results right out of the box. So you can see an example here where we have brown hair color, or in this case used as fur. And then if we wanted, we could easily create hair colors like white, for example. So a lot of parameters go quite deep as well with it. So if you want to create dyed hairstyles or things like that, you can do a lot of different things. So very, very cool. And again, super straightforward for just getting some nice looking results right out of the box. So highly recommend checking out the new hair material. We've also integrated the new improved sun and sky. So a big focus for the improved sky model is that we wanted to make it so that you could get sunrises and sunsets that are much more striking and dynamic looking. So you can see here on the right an example of it. Basically just helps to get you really interesting results, particularly if you have the sun lower than the horizon level. So if you want to have a sunset that has a very low sun on the horizon, you can get a kind of more interesting and dynamic looking sky. In particular, we've also, again, tried to simplify workflows for you. So we've now automatically linked the sun and sky when you add it to your scene. So just making things faster to get working with it. And you can see a few examples we've got here of the new improved sky in action. So this would be just having the sun up in the sky, kind of an afternoon type of sunlight scenario. And we could also easily create like an evening sky scenario, bringing the sun down. And if we wanted to put the sun in the frame, create like a nice sunset scenario here, you can see we get some nice dynamic looking results in the sky. And just a comparison of some different results you could get. For example, on the left, we have the new improved sky, and on the right, we have the HOSEC sky. So you can see the improved sky is just giving us some more interesting colors there in the sky, kind of more rich hue there. And on the right, with the HOSEC sky, we mainly just have some shades of yellow. So again, highly recommend checking out the new improved sky model. It's just amazing what you can get with it, and it's also very easy to use. So definitely worth checking out if you're creating some sunset scenarios. We've also improved the volume grid in V-Ray 5. So we've basically updated it now so that you can preview animations in the viewport, and this will allow you to create and view animations of smoke or fire, clouds or water. So basically you can load in any volumetric caches and get a really nice preview without having to render. We've basically rebuilt it from scratch. So it also now supports external volumetric caches, so you can load in OpenBDB files or Field 3D files as well. So again, just much more robust and able to get you some really nice previews now without having to do a full render. So just to show you an example, you can see here in the viewport, we're just changing the quality of the preview there. And if we were to play the timeline, we can see the animation actually in the viewport of this fire and smoke. So that's fire and smoke cache we loaded into the volume grid. And if we start an interactive render, we can also, of course, see it in the interactive render. And if we move along the viewport there, we'll see it update in the interactive renderer. So again, just super useful now that you can get that preview right there in the viewport. And of course, you can get some really amazing results using a volume grid if you import some interesting volume caches. So here's just an example of using interesting smoke here with the ship landing and putting that with a volume grid. So again, really powerful tool that we've rewritten here to just be much more useful and much quicker to work with. So highly recommend checking that out. And as I mentioned earlier, we're always trying to increase support for our Chaos Group products. So in particular, we have now integrated support for VR scans. So if you're not familiar with VR scans, this is our library of over 1,000 materials. These are incredibly photorealistic, ultra high quality materials. So these can get you some really nice close-up shots of materials, and they're going to look super realistic. You can see even an example there on the right of some VR scans. They're all created from thousands of scanned images. So we capture the material without any loss of detail and just maintain its fidelity and color. And it's just really, really powerful when you want to get a really high quality looking result. They're incredibly easy to use as well, and they're seamlessly tileable. So it's definitely something to check out if you haven't looked into VR scans before, since they are now supported with V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D. And we've also fully integrated Chaos Cloud support. So Chaos Cloud is our push button cloud rendering service. There's no hardware that you have to configure with it. You don't have to set up any virtual machines. It basically just gives you a button to access a supercomputer for rendering. So if you use Chaos Cloud, you'll be able to do an incredibly fast rendering without having to use your machine. You can free up your machine and keep working rather than waiting. You can even render multiple jobs on Chaos Cloud at the same time. And it's just incredibly useful. In fact, a cool thing too is that you can even monitor your render on the cloud from your smartphone. So you can even go mobile and keep an eye on how things are going. And in addition to that, we also now support Cinema 4D textures with Chaos Cloud and distributed rendering. So if you've ever tried it before and had any issues with Cinema 4D textures in particular, I think you'll be pleased to know that the Chaos Cloud and distributed rendering are both supporting those now. So on that note, we are at our first little intermission here. So we're going to have a little question and answer session. I'm here again with Ivan Shaikov. He's our product specialist for V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D. So Ivan, have you had a chance to look over some questions and see if there's anything you'd like to kick us off with?
Yes, thank you, Corey, and hello, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today. I did scroll through most of the questions, and I can start answering them. And the first one here is, what about V-Ray 4? V-Ray 4 is actually in our plans to be delivered very soon because it's one of the features that most of the users were asking for. Currently, there is a workaround for it, and it's to use the Cinema 4D here until we implement this feature in the near future. Right, there's another question here. Right verticals, tilt shift. Is there a simple setting, or has it always to be adjusted manually in the camera settings? In most of the V-Ray integrations, we used to have a button that automatically calculates the vertical tilt and shift. We do have in our plans to add such buttons in Cinema 4D, in V-Ray for Cinema 4D. But for now, it's not there, so stay tuned for that. Okay, moving down. The main question we have in our studio is, does the compatibility to older 3.7 scenes will get better? Well, this is a kind of question that could be discussed a lot, but basically we are improving the scene converter with every single feature that we add. Basically, I wouldn't expect the old scenes to be fully converted to V-Ray 5, mainly because of the big difference that the big gap that stays between V-Ray 3 and V-Ray 5, because a lot of stuff has changed inside the V-Ray core. And now when we have the lights, for example, as a separate objects, this kind of adds to the equation. So yes, it is going to get better as we are progressing with the feature set that we're adding to V-Ray. All right, moving down. What is the best way to set up an HDRI image as a light and a background? Well, currently, this could be done by just adding a dome light and attaching an HDRI image inside the texture slot and using the Cinema 4D background object to add a background plate for. So in that way, the dome light will actually light the scene and the background will serve as a background plate for whatever you want to put in front of in the background. Okay, moving down. Oh, my history isn't working. Well, you have to set to enable it inside the options and set a custom path where you want to store the files for the history to be saved. And this is, of course, something that will improve in the future. That this should happen automatically, and the user shouldn't be involved in that process. So thank you for that question. Okay. I would love to see a node editor in Cinema 4D. Yes, this is something that I would love to see as well. And we're, of course, thinking about this because it's something that is essential nowadays. And we are actually thinking about investigating the Cinema 4D default node editor because it's always best to kind of rely on what the software already has instead of implementing something new that would inevitably delay most of the V-Ray features that are already missing from the old V-Ray 3.7, for example.
Ivan, I saw someone was asking which sky model we had used in the scene here, and I thought I would just clarify as well, so everyone's aware too that most of the images that we were showing there, especially at the end with the sunsets and the sky there, was all using the new improved sky model. And we'll also actually touch on here at the end, doing some post-processing in a moment here, where you'll actually get to see the sky model where we also use that instant renders and just get a better look at it as well. So something to keep in mind.
Okay, I think I can answer one more question before we continue. What about bitmaps in shaders for distributed rendering? No more advanced materials? Yes, now you don't need to add advanced bitmaps inside shaders for them to work in distributed rendering. You just need to use the default cinema for the bitmap for this, or if you want more control, you can use the V-Ray advanced bitmap inside. But with V-Ray 5, this is not a must. It's only optional. And with that being said, of course, it should work with V-Ray Cloud as well, with Chaos Cloud, not only with distributed rendering.
All right.
Okay,
guys.
Corey, maybe we should continue.
Yeah, I guess we'll continue forward. We're going to answer some more questions at the end here, and thank you, Yvonne, for taking a look at those. I guess at this stage, we can go ahead and move into the second half of the presentation. And at this point, in particular, we're going to focus on the new post-processing features in V-Ray 5. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at those. So as I mentioned earlier on, a big feature for V-Ray 5 is the new layer-based editing and also the new light mixer. So light mixing basically is the ability to add a light mix render element, and whenever you've done a render or even rendering interactively, this will give you a panel called the light mixer, which will allow you to make changes to your lights. So you can do changes to their brightness or using a multiplier. You can also make changes to their color, and you can turn lights on and off. So this is actually a really, really powerful tool because you can do all of this without needing to re-render anything. And in addition to that, the ability to change lights can actually give you some really amazing capabilities. So for example, you could take a scene that looks like it's an afternoon scene or something and make it look like an evening scene, all by just making changes in the light mixer. And you can do all of that without even having to re-render it. So you can even make a scene that's maybe not as stylized, look more stylized. Just tons of possibilities with it. And it's, again, just super easy to use, and you won't have to do any re-rendering. In addition, it even changes your workflow a bit. So if you'd like to work with your lights non-destructively, you could even, for example, do an interactive render and then make changes to the lights while you're interactively rendering using the light mixer. So this is something cool too, because you won't actually have to go to your different lights parameters. You can just control all of your lights in one nice convenient panel there. And this will let you, make changes to the lights while you work. And again, it's all non-destructive, so you could always undo your changes or quickly reset things if you want to. Of course, the other big change here is introducing the layer-based editor. So this is where you'll also be able to do compositing in V-Ray 5. So a really cool thing here is that not only can you do color corrections and make changes to the overall image, but you can also composite specific render elements. So you could combine render elements, you could work with blending modes for different render elements, and really you can go quite deep with this to compose your image and just fully polish it and do it all within V-Ray 5 rather than having to switch to another application or anything like that. So incredibly powerful, and I'd love to actually show you guys a little demonstration of both the light mixer and the compositor at work here. So let's go ahead and actually head over into Cinema 4D, and I will give you guys, walk you through a little live demo here of that. So you can see here that I've got the V-Ray frame buffer open in Cinema 4D, and at this stage we've already loaded in an image here. So as I was mentioning earlier, we have the new improved sky model. that's also been shown throughout the webinar here. This image was rendered with that, and you can see we've got a nice little snowy ski village here. So I'd love to see how we can use the light mixer now to actually make some drastic changes to this. In particular, the image is a little too dark for my taste, and I feel like we can make it a little bit more stylized, maybe make the colors pop out a bit more, just to make things more interesting. So in order to do that, and really to get started with light mixing, the first thing you'll want to do is just head over to the source layer. So if you go over into the layer panel here and click on the source layer, you'll see that down below we have properties for 3 different modes. So we have an RGB mode, we have a light mix mode, and a composite mode. So RGB, pretty self-explanatory, it's just your rendered image. And then if you click on the light mix mode here, this will give you the panel for controlling the lights. So to give you a quick tour, basically you have checkboxes that enable you to turn lights on and off. You have these little multiplier values to control how bright or dim the lights are. And then you have the color swatch here that will let you change the color of the lights. So let's go ahead and see how we can make some changes to the image. In my case, I really like to start by just kind of building the main lights up from scratch. So it's, in that case, an easy thing you can do is just click the all checkbox. That'll turn off all the lights in the scene, and then you can start with the lights that you want to focus on. So I'm going to start with the V-Ray sky here, since that's kind of like our main contributing light source to the scene. And the first thing I'd like to do is maybe just give it a bit more color. It's right now it was set a little bit low, so let's see if we can brighten it up a bit and maybe make it maybe it's something like a kind of a purplish evening color. So I've clicked on that color swatch, and when I open that up, I can move it around, and you can see that as I drag along in the color swatch to set it to something purple, it will update right away in the frame buffer. So this is really cool because you can actually drag and feel out, hey, what is the right color here that I'm trying to get. So it's very, very powerful, very responsive, and just super useful if you're trying to make changes to your lights. So there's something I found earlier that was working pretty well. So I'll just put in the RGB values for that. And then let's move forward and maybe make some changes to the brightness. So that's kind of a purplish color that I thought was looking pretty good, but it's still looking too dark. So I'm going to bring up the multiplier. And again, just like with the color swatch, you can also drag and just move the mouse, and you'd be able to actually get real-time feedback and just see how that affects the image. So in this case, I want it to be a bit brighter, so maybe we'll do something around 1.8. And you'll see, there we go, we're getting a nice glowing sun. And yeah, I'm liking how that looks. So let's go ahead and then enable the next major set of lights. So that would be these lights that were all part of this little town here. So if I click on self-illumination, that's containing all of those lights. And of course, the train lights here as well. And the first thing I'm noticing is it's way too dim. I want this to feel like a proper evening scenario where the lights are really shining brightly. So let's go ahead and bring this up maybe to something like 3.5. And there we go, that's boosting those nicely. And I'd also like to make these a bit warmer. So again, we can use the color swatch here to just change the color, kind of drag around and find something that works for us. A bit too warm. So something around here. I'll go ahead and also input a value again that I thought looked pretty good earlier. So again, just putting in some RGB values. And this will give us a nice warmer looking result. There we go. Great, so at this point, I'm liking how these main light sources are looking, and I think we can go ahead and enable the rest of the lights in the scene. So I'll just check the all box again. This will turn on the rest of the lights. One thing that's noticeable to me though is that it's still too dim looking for these lights here. So I'm gonna bring up some more lights. So let's start with the train lights. So that would be these lights over here. Again, we can drag just to see how that affects them. It's clear to me that they need to be boosted quite a bit. So let's bring them up to something a bit more than the self-illumination lights, so maybe like 4. And then we can do the same for these different lights that are part of the houses and the streets here. So I'll increase these to maybe something like 3 and do the same for the back ones. And then again, if you're ever wondering what is a light contributing to the scene, you can turn the light off and you can see, okay, it's that light over there. So let's go ahead and bring that up just a little bit to 2. And there we go. So now I've made some changes to the image, and obviously we're getting quite a bit different result than what we started with. So in fact, if you ever want to compare, you can always go over to the RGB button here. And since it's non-destructive, you can always revert to your RGB image and just see how that looks. So there's a little comparison for you of what we started with and what we've arrived at now. So very, very powerful what you can do with the light mixer. I mean, you can really make tons of different changes and make an image look drastically different than what you started with. And if you really like what you've done, but maybe you want to experiment a bit more, you can also even save out a preset. So you could even load in multiple light mix changes that you've done just to see how that all affects the image. At this stage, though, I'd like to go ahead and move on to compositing. So in this case, I'm going to load in a separate image just because I want to have a little more variety for us so that we can composite something a bit different here. So I'm going to click the reset button to reset my changes, and then let's go ahead and load in the next image. So just a moment while I load that in. And there we go. So you can see this is essentially the same scene here. We just have the sun is moved off screen now since it's more of an afternoon light. Again, though, we're using the new improved sky model. And at this stage, I'd like to see how we can do some changes in compositing. So at this point, we can switch from light mix over to the composite mode. So compositing, of course, is going to take place up in the layer-based editor here. So to start off, I'm going to have this source composite layer selected. And this is where we can add things like render elements and do some actual compositing with those. So maybe to kick things off, let's go ahead and click on the green plus icon here. And this will show me the different color correction tools available as well as the render element option. And let's select render element and see what we can do. So down below in the properties, you'll see we have an opacity layer just to control the visibility of it. We also have blend modes. And of course, we can choose different render elements. And then there's a multiplier value and again, a color swatch. So I'm going to go ahead and change this over to the atmospheric effects since I'd like to see what we can do to bring out the atmosphere a bit in this image. So you can see since we're on the overwrite blend mode that we're just seeing the atmospheric effects. So that's helpful as well, just to see kind of what's going on and what that's contributing. And let's switch the mode here to screen. So I'd like to bring out, again, some of the atmosphere in the background here, maybe make this feel a little bit snowier, maybe more like misty mountains here. So again, just by simply switching over and having this blend mode set to screen with the atmospheric effects, we're already giving ourselves some nice atmospheric effects in the background here. And I'm also going to maybe just tweak the color a bit so we can make it some sort of a blue color, maybe kind of a darkish blue, something that will just help it match a little better with the sky. So again, I found some values that I think worked pretty well for me earlier, so I'll just go ahead and input those. So we stick to kind of the result I got, and you'll see we get a nice looking shade of blue. And at this point, I'd also like to see, though, how I could bring those out a bit more. So let's see how we can add a correction layer on top of the atmospheric effects. So if I have the atmospheric effects selected here, and I click on the green plus icon, I can add the curves. So if I add the curves, you'll see now that they are next to a downward pointing arrow. And this is just indicating that the curves are affecting only the atmospheric effects. So any changes I make to the curves layer is going to affect the atmosphere and nothing else. So that's a really cool feature to just keep your color corrections isolated. So I usually like to change the mode and the theme over to color grading. And at this point, we can make changes to it. So I'm just going to bring out the atmospheric effects just a little bit. So bump up their visibility a bit, just to make that background a little bit thicker looking and a bit hazier. So there we go. I'm liking how that looks. And now let's go ahead and add another render layer. So again, select the source composite layer, go to the plus icon, and let's add another render element. So at this point, we can switch it over to reflections. So I'd like to bring out the reflections a bit here. And you'll see here, once we've added that, the blend mode is already on add. We're already getting some more reflections coming out here in the snow. It's very noticeable there. But let's see if we can bring those up a bit more, since I kind of want this snow to look like, the sun's been shining on it a while and maybe warming it up a little bit, so it's a little bit melting. So we can bring up the reflections to something like 1.5. And you'll see that that updates, and then we can get some nicer looking reflections. And maybe I'll add a curves to it as well, just to boost that a little bit more. So we can click on the curves here, bring that out a bit. There we go. And now we've got some nice and strong looking reflections. Maybe even tone it down just a tiny bit. And one cool thing too is that, once you've made changes, you can always quickly see the contribution they've made. So if you click on this eyeball icon for the reflection layer, that will actually just hide it. So now we don't have any extra reflections. And if we enable them again, we can just see the new contribution they're making. So there we go. That's adding a lot more reflections for us, making things look nice. And at this point, I'd like to actually just see what we can do to make some changes, not only to render elements, but to the overall image. So at this stage, we can actually select the display correction. So just to go to the top layer, everything at the top here is going to be in the foreground, and everything below it's going to be in the background. So if we want to add something to the top of the image, now with the display correction layer selected, we can add a color correction. So in this case, I'm going to add the white balance. So I'd like to see if we can make the image just a little bit cooler looking. It's a little bit warm looking for my taste, and I kind of want to just have more of a bluish tone. So we can just slide the temperature value on the white balance, and that will allow us to bring down the temperature of the image. So let's see, just to show you can make it warmer. In this case, I want it to be something maybe around 5,500. So it'll just give us a nice, cool looking image. There we go. That's looking more wintry for my taste. And at this stage, we can maybe add one more color correction just to help bring out some of the image's contrast, maybe help to make things feel a little more dynamic. So if you go again to the display correction and let's add a filmic tone map. So the filmic tone map is going to basically allow you to control the dynamic range of the image. It comes with a bunch of preset types that are going to allow you to affect things like the midtones and the shadows and the highlights, and can give you some really interesting looking results. So I'll show you just an example here of the 5 different types that we have with the filmic tone map. So if we click the linear layer, you can see the effect that has. If we go to the next one, you can see just kind of the effect that each of the tone maps has. And some of these are also going to have additional parameters below that you can control. In this case, I think, I like how this power curve one looks. So let's see if we can just bring that down a little bit as well. So make it a little bit brighter right now. This parameter is just making it a little too dark for my taste. So bring those down just a tiny bit. There we go. And maybe we can bump the contrast on it just a little bit as well. There we go. All right, great. So yeah, I'm liking how this looks. I think this is a nice little composite here we've done. And of course, if you ever want to just compare it, you can always, again, go to the RGB layer and just see what we originally had. So all of our compositing changes are non-destructive. But in this case, I'm happy with that. I like how that looks. We've brought out the fog, and it's just feeling quite a bit more wintry to me. And I think that's a good change. So another cool thing I want to mention, though, is that you can also save and load in presets. So if you go up to the save icon here, you'd be able to save these changes we've made in the compositor as a preset. And then we could even load in other versions. So if you want to try out different looks on the same scene or the same image, you'd be able to do that very easily. And another cool thing is that there's a little icon here that works like a shortcut. This will allow you to specify a folder where you want to save your presets, and then you can just quickly switch between them for comparison. So to do that, go to the options and go to the VFB settings. And then if you go to your layers tab, you'll be able to specify the preset path for where you want those different presets you're going to store to be saved. Hit save and close here. And then once you've done that, you would be able to easily scroll and access those presets, and you can just hover your mouse over each of these and see the results. So in this case, I already made some other composites here with the exact same image. Nothing, again, has changed in rendering. This is all using the same rendered result and just making some changes in compositing to see how that affects the image. So very, very cool to see just what you can achieve with the compositor and also doing some light mixing. It's all incredibly powerful. Again, all of this is non-destructive, and we did not render anything different here. It's all using the same rendered image and done all within the V-Ray 5 frame buffer. So again, super powerful just to see what all you can accomplish using compositing and light mixing. As you can see here, even making a scene look like an evening scenario. So again, just amazing what you can do with post-processing in V-Ray 5 and doing it all within the V-Ray 5 frame buffer. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was our little live demo there of some light mixing and compositing in V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D. And I think at this stage, we can go ahead and have another Q&A session. And we'll see if Yvonne's had any questions in particular that he'd like to touch on. So again, I'll take a look at the questions here as well. And Yvonne, anything you'd like to touch on at the moment?
Well, yes, there are a few more questions that we have here, well, quite a lot actually, now that I scroll down. First one is, can you bring caches from Phoenix to Cinema 4D on a Mac? Yes, you can. As soon as you have the Aura caches simulated, you can load them inside Cinema 4D by using the V-Ray volume grid, and you'll be able to render whatever it's inside the cache. Okay, here we have a question from Chris Phillips. I know we've been asked this before and probably makes you dizzy, but a note editor is absolutely key for the future. Yes, we do have plans for adding a note editor, as I mentioned before, and it is our top priority. We have a few questions here from Tom D. He has a question about displacement. Does it work on polygon selection? And right now, the material with polygon selection does not forward this information to the displacement. Well, we do have plans to look into this because this is not the first time when we were asked about this. So having this is obviously something that would be a very nice feature to have. So yes, we will fix this in the future, and we are looking into this. Light mixing animation, is it possible inside the VFB? Currently, no, because the light mixing is only for the currently loaded frame. But it's a nice feature to have, so I'll forward this to our developers so we can look into this and what we could do in that regard.
Ivan, someone had mentioned about whether there's a material library, and I think a question about whether there will be plans to release a material library. And at the moment, we don't have a material library for Cinema 4D like the one like V-Ray for SketchUp, but this is something we're definitely having plans on adding. I don't know, Ivan, if there's anything else we can share at the moment, but it is something on the to-do list.
Yes, it is in our to-do list. Thank you for this one, Corey. It is in our to-do list, and if it's going to be integrated with the Cinema 4D browser or not, this is something that we haven't still decided. So this is a question that needs to be answered later.
Cool.
How does V-Ray 5 handle the native Cinema 4D texture and convert them? Well, currently, I'll actually answer two questions with this one. Currently, we support a few shaders natively. The Cinema 4D noises, the filter shader, and the layer shader, as well as the ramp shader and the Fresnel and fall-off ones. And all the other textures are pre-baked inside the render settings and inside the V-Ray bake Cinema 4D bake texture. There are options to that controls those pre-baked texture. Is ACES workflow in the development roadmap? Yes, it is. Currently, some of you might already saw the some ACES options inside the VFB, and I will quickly answer you that they won't produce you the correct results since the whole ACES workflow needs some settings to be added inside the V-Ray settings for it to work correctly. So yes, it is in our roadmap.
Ivan, there was a question someone
Yes.
had asked about doing specifically tutorials for beginners and focusing kind of from a beginner perspective with C4D and V-Ray. So I just wanted to add a little something there. We are planning to do tutorials in the future here, and in particular, we're actually looking for suggestions on any specific areas in 3D and rendering that you think would be helpful. So if you're a beginner and wondering over a specific area of V-Ray that you might have questions about, please feel free to give any specific suggestions, because we're definitely looking to factor those into some of the content we'll create. And hopefully we can cover some topics that would be especially useful for beginners, as well as those of you who are been using V-Ray for years. So yeah, we'd love to hear any specific ideas from you guys, because we will be creating some tutorial content in the future.
Yeah, and of course, this also applies to not only to people that are new to V-Ray, but to existing V-Ray users, because since 3.7, a lot of the workflow with V-Ray 5 has changed, and any suggestions for tutorials are welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, there's some, it's not actually a question, but we need V-Ray scenes for DCC Exchange. Yes, the option to import V-Ray scenes is also with a high priority on our list to be delivered soon, since interoperability is really important at that point when we are making V-Ray 5 to be the same as our other integrations. Okay, I'm scrolling down and looking for some other questions.
There was a question someone was asking, can we basically transfer light mix settings to the lights in our scene? So at the moment, there isn't an option to send them to the scene yet, but this is something we are planning to implement. So it'll be a button in the light mix settings in the future to be able to send those changes you make there to the lights in the scene. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Yvonne, at the moment.
There is an interesting question about materials from the old V-Ray. Will the materials from old V-Ray versions work with this version, and do we need to or do we need to rebuild the current library? I would suggest trying to convert them first, and then if the result doesn't really suit you, then try to rebuild your library. We have made the converter to work with the most used materials. So especially when there is something that doesn't work well, it will be best if it could be reported to us so we can fix it. So if the converter doesn't work, then it will be best if you rebuild your current library, especially if you use some features that are still present in V-Ray 3.7 and are still not implemented in V-Ray 5. That will be best. Do you develop a converter for Cinema 4D materials? No, currently we don't develop a converter, but it is planned to be done, as well as trying to convert materials from other render engines like Corona, for example. But it's still far away in our plans, if I can say so. Is there a chance to convert advanced materials? The advanced materials should be easy convertible with the current converter, scene converter that is implemented with V-Ray 5. So try that and let us know if you have any issues. We'll be happy to help with this.
Yvonne, someone was asking if there are differences between CPU and GPU rendering in V-Ray 5. And there's two things I wanted to mention on that for you guys. So first of all, again, in V-Ray 5, most features are now supported on GPU. So in general, you'll find feature-wise a lot of similarity. Not everything, but a lot of things. And also, in general, we recommend that if you're starting a project, generally it's best to pick one engine and stick with it for that project. Ultimately they are different engines, so we do our best to make V-Ray GPU and V-Ray give the same results. But generally speaking, it's still best to pick one and stick with it. I don't know if there's anything in particular else you'd want to share about that, Ivan, but that's just a recommendation for workflow when using one or the other.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Corey said. Basically, we're trying to make sure that people start their project with one of the engines and continue working with it and switch only if necessary. There is a question here from Tobias. To lighten up a scene with an HDRI, you should take an V-Ray advanced bitmap, right? No, with V-Ray 5, you don't need to do that. That was something that was an issue with V-Ray 3.7 and was fixed with V-Ray 5. As I mentioned before, this also applies for distributed rendering and cloud rendering. You don't need to put every bitmap inside the V-Ray bitmap shader.
Yep.
Okay, moving on.
Ivan, I think we probably got time for one more question if you want to pinpoint any last one.
Yeah, let's pick one important then. Let me just scroll through them really quickly.
One thing I'll note too, guys, is just someone was asking about the tutorials that we'll be making and whether they'll be free. So yeah, our tutorial content, at least for now, is planned to be put out online on YouTube. So you can always check out our YouTube channel. It's Chaos Group TV. And if you subscribe to that, when we have new videos or if we have some tutorial content that we've uploaded, you'll be able to see it there for free.
Okay, here's one last question. Does V-Ray 5 work with hair now? At my R23, it doesn't work with the latest version. Well, it should be working. Please let us know if it doesn't. Because the last test we made, it was working fine. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, we can.
Well, I guess that's it. Yeah,
we can wrap up. It's about 12 after. So, again, guys, thank you so much for attending the webinar. Really hope you all found this helpful. And again, if we couldn't get to your question during this segment, or if we haven't gotten a chance to get to it in the chat, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. And on that note, I think we can go ahead and wrap this up. So just want to say a really big thank you to everyone for attending. If you're new and haven't tried V-Ray before, or specifically tried V-Ray 5 for Cinema 4D, you can try it free on our website. So you can follow the link here, and that'll take you to a free trial. And otherwise, again, just want to emphasize that we've rewritten a lot of V-Ray 5 from scratch. So we're still integrating a lot of the features I know you all are looking for, and we hope you'll stick with us and just keep your eyes peeled for some of the new updates down the road, since we're incredibly excited about many of the new features we're building. And we hope you guys have just enjoyed this session and gotten a nice understanding of some of the new features currently available in V-Ray 5. So a big thank you from myself and from Ivan for attending, and hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you also for the suggestions for the tutorials, so we can keep those in mind for the future. And on that note, again, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Chaos Group TV, for more updates. And otherwise, thanks for attending the webinar, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.